So welcome everybody. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm the lead author of this report, Fueling the Future, Hydrogen's Role in the Low Carbon Transition, which there might be some copies left on the side, so I'd encourage you to read it, or at least the executive summary. I appreciate it's a particularly long one. So let me introduce the speakers first and foremost, and the format for today's event. So I'll give some introductory remarks, some high-level recommendations from the report, followed by some remarks from our sponsors. I'm very thankful to the EUA and for Uniper for sponsoring this work. So we'll get their take on what they're interested in hydrogen and why they wanted to support us in this. Then we'll follow by a panel discussion. So I'm delighted to have Claire Jackson here, who is the Hydrogen Hub Manager at the Hydrogen Hub, David Joff, who's the Head of Research at the CCC, Professor Marcus Newborough, who's the Development Director at ITM Power, and last but not least, Simon Clark, who's a Member of Parliament for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. So carefully curated this panel today. They kind of reflect some of the key themes that emerged from the report, particularly around the production side, and also around the idea around hydrogen clustering and hydrogen hubs, particularly around the northeast. And obviously, Simon's here and can reflect on that today. So housekeeping rules, just to let you all know, there is no fire drill today planned. So if you do hear one, it isn't a drill. So please act accordingly. So I will just begin with some high-level remarks from the paper, and then we'll launch straight into our remarks from our sponsors. So just to give some background of the report, the concept of a hydrogen economy has been put forward by proponents for many decades. In theory, this abundant element is a perfect solution to our climate energy needs. It does not produce greenhouse gases when burnt. It can be stored in large quantities for long periods, and it can be used as a fuel in virtually every sector of our economy, from transport to heavy industry to home heating. Yet the potential of hydrogen has yet to be realised. Electric cars are beginning to get a foothold in the market, while those powered by hydrogen fuel cells have stalled. In heavy industry, the lack of a serious carbon tax disincentivises the move to cleaner alternatives than coal and gas. And although hydrogen does not produce CO2 when it's burnt, the primary method of producing it, steam methane reformation, does. So before this is a reality in the UK and globally, the report outlines two high-level issues that need addressing. The first is on production side. So we need to work on cost-effective, scalable and sustainable production methods, and these need to reach mass market. So targeting investment towards reducing the high cost of producing large volumes of low-carbon hydrogen is crucial. I'm grateful for Marcus joining today so we can get the perspective of him and how electrolysis, coupled with renewables, and how that can potentially provide some hydrogen for the future in a clean way. The second thing to note, and one of the report outlines, is that we need to ensure that we take a whole system thinking approach to the use of hydrogen. This is essential to determine the most appropriate application of hydrogen in the economy. This is because different uses for hydrogen are likely to be highly interconnected, and this will have implications for the energy system. And the last thing I would like to add about the report and the way it was framed is that projections of decarbonising pathways have typically involved reducing dependence on natural gas through the greater electrification of heat and transport. However, the gas networks also hold value in relation to flexibility of operation and enabling less expensive storage at scale compared to electric heaters or pumps. So retaining and repurposing gas infrastructure to accommodate hydrogen and other sustainable biogases may be worthwhile, particularly as barriers to electrification of heat persist. So, set against this context, the debate has often been framed as either electrification or greener gases to achieve decarbonisation targets. Yet this polarisation presents a false dichotomy which could lead to policy paralysis. Transport is perhaps the only exception where the choice is more binary. So within this overarching premise, the report takes a systematic view of hydrogen to help overcome the challenges the UK faces when transitioning into a low-carbon economy. The report is structured around three key challenges. How do we integrate variable renewable energy and increasing amounts of this? How do we decarbonise hard-to-reach sectors, heat, transport, industry? And how do we replace natural gas as an energy system buffer? And this is where hydrogen also has potential. So recognising the importance of specific local circumstances are important relating to electricity or gas, which will determine what mix of decarbonised options are available. So I guess the key message here is balance is key. Hydrogen is not a silver bullet, but it will have a potential role in the future. So with that, I'll hand over to Felix to get his views. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. My name is Felix Lurch. I'm the Executive Chairman of Uniper here in the UK. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And renewable generation is growing. And at Uniper, we do believe that this development creates an opportunity to establish power to gas, in short PTG, and many acronyms in the UK. That is, converting renewable electricity into green hydrogen. This technology can make an important contribution to decarbonizing heat and transport. To assess its potential, we've already built 2 pilot projects in Germany, and we hope that we can establish PTG in the UK too. Our company has a lot of expertise in global gas and LNG, and that is know-how that we can also bring to a future hydrogen market. However, there's always a however in this. As with all new developments, we need the right market conditions and policy framework in the UK to facilitate this. A bit about Uniper. We're an international energy company with about 12,000 people operating in 40 countries. We operate about 37 gigawatt of generating capacity in Europe and Russia, more than 8 billion cubic meters of gas storage capacity, and are one of the largest energy trading houses in Europe, with global positions in commodities, natural gas and LNG. In the UK, we have about 1,000 people working for us, are probably the 6th largest generator of electricity. We'll see how that looks after the Drax deal, and also operate a fast cycle gas storage facility at Holford in Cheshire. We have specialist engineering services, technical services, as well as an engineering academy at Radcliffe-on-Soar, something we're very proud of, where we have a long track record of delivering high-quality engineering apprenticeships and training. Let us talk a little bit about hydrogen technology. Historically, as Joshua has pointed out, it's been a binary view of the world, and we didn't compare notes up front. Yeah? When it comes to the topic of decarbonizing the economy, will it be an electrified system or a decarbonized gas system? Recently, the discussion has been maturing, taking into account local infrastructure capabilities, defining what is needed actually, and what can be realistically achieved. Research that was recently carried out on behalf of the Natural Infrastructure Commission covered a number of scenarios. One comparison suggests that using the existing gas grid could result in savings of at least £60 billion by 2050 compared to a fully electrification solution to decarbonizing heat. This is important, as we also have to consider cost impact on different solutions. This is where natural gas comes in. It plays an important role in powering industry, heating homes, and generating electricity. In partnership with renewables, natural gas contributes to security of supply. And most commentators suggest that this role will continue for some time to come. And now for the however. However, as an energy company, we will not be able to continue using gas as a fuel indefinitely. If we are to meet the UK's decarbonization targets for 2050, we'll have to either capture carbon emissions or switch to a lower carbon fuel. And this is where hydrogen could come in to help decarbonize sectors such as domestic and industrial heat and transport. Policy exchange analysis indicates that power to gas from excess renewable generation alone cannot produce sufficient volumes to decarbonize heat and transport. However, PTG uses a green source of electricity to produce a green gas and has one of the lowest emission intensities. The technology is proven, and costs are expected to be comparable to steam methane reformation, or SMR, if you combine it with carbon capture storage by 2030. This is important, as in our view, it does not make sense to focus on SMR alone. SMR produces CO2 en route to produce hydrogen. In other words, it is a brown technology to create a green gas. So what we're looking for is all solutions. Offshore wind, on the other hand, is expected to expand further in the next decade. Hence, there's significant growth potential for hydrogen production from excess renewable electricity. Policy Exchange's report highlights that electrolysis could produce hydrogen at a lower cost and with lower overall emissions compared to SMR. In other words, hydrogen production by electrolysis could be the UK's next success story, similar to offshore wind. So what are we doing in the hydrogen space? Uniper operates 2 green pilot projects in Germany using different technologies. We have a 2 megawatt unit in Falkenhagen based on conventional alkaline electrolysis, and that facility has been operating successfully for the last 3 years. Produced 8 gigawatt hours of hydrogen and injected that into the gas stream with a concentration of up to 2%. We have a 1.5 megawatt plant in Hamburg, and that's based on proton exchange membrane technology and has been in operations since 2015 too. So technology to produce green hydrogen already exists. And we believe that there should be support for technology projects of this kind to stimulate the development of truly clean energy sources in the UK context. To make this happen, it is important that we have the right market conditions and policy framework. We already have a competitive global market for natural gas. It is possible that a similar market for hydrogen could emerge in the future. To do this, the UK will need to develop a market framework and to stimulate demand to reward production, so we can help overcome the current cost difference between natural gas and hydrogen. The renewable sector is a UK success story that can be replicated for hydrogen. We have a good experience of using support mechanisms in this country. For example, renewable obligations, contract for difference, you name it. And that has helped establish an industry and drive down technology costs. And we believe that a similar approach could be taken for hydrogen. To make it happen, we also need to develop standards to incorporate hydrogen in the economy. Projects like High Deploy at Kiel University indicate that it could be possible to increase the hydrogen context in natural gas by up to 20% without impacting domestic consumers, just by amending gas safety regulations. And in this context, it was good to see that the Institute of Gas Engineers and Managers has been funded by the UK government under the High4Heat scheme to review standards for hydrogen, and that has happened earlier this month. So in conclusion, if we are serious about growing the hydrogen economy, it requires leadership and coordination across sectors to implement such a development. At Uniper, we are ready to contribute to a green hydrogen future. In policy timescales, this needs to be in place sometime in the early 20s. The Policy Exchange report highlights these aspects. And from our view, this is an important contribution to the hydrogen debate, and we are pleased to be associated with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. So next I'll ask Mike to come up and give his view of the EUA.
Thanks, Josh. My name's Mike Foster. I'm Chief Executive of Energy Utilities Alliance, a trade association working in the energy sector. Can I begin by, first of all, thanking Policy Exchange, Josh and the team, for the work that they've done in pulling this report together, and say that we've now worked on a couple of projects with Policy Exchange, and we're delighted with what we have seen. There are some organisations that you, quite frankly, can tell them what the outcome of the report you want. They'll write the report and you pay them the money. Policy Exchange are not like that. You give them a grant and away they go and write the report, and it's a bit of a test of faith in the arguments that you have. But with that comes, I think, far greater influence in the eventual outcomes from the work of Policy Exchange. And in doing so, you also get the challenge as a result of some of the questions that are still to be answered for industry and government alike. And hopefully, Joyce, that gets me a discount for the next report that we might want to work with you. It's very timely, the launch today. This week is Green GB Week, as you know or should know. Last week, IPCC report came out with that focus on the urgency across the globe to decarbonise, to meet the challenges. This year, we have seen the beast from the east in March. We've seen a summer heat wave. And I read today in the paper, and you may not have read it yet, but that well-known weather forecaster, Piers Corbyn, is predicting a polar vector to hit the United Kingdom and to give us 4 months of really cold weather. So be prepared for that, and you heard it here first. But that variation of demand upon the UK's energy system requires us to be as flexible as we possibly can to meet our needs. And gas, by the very nature of its form, its ability to be stored for long periods without deteriorating, its ability to be compressed and then released safely when it's needed, is for many people I know the energy vector of choice for that flexibility. And the very nature of peak heat demands that we see each year, we see each week, has brought, certainly from our experience in the other part of this year around March, has brought that sharply into focus. And as Felix has highlighted, it does call into question that coalition policy of around 2010, 2011, where it was deemed that all heat in the UK would be produced by electricity. Our view is that gas is going to be around and is going to be used for decades to come. But we absolutely acknowledge that that gas needs to be decarbonised. Whether it's blending biogases into the grid to dilute the methane impact, producing synthetic natural gas from waste, those are great, they work. But more radically, over the last few years, we have seen hydrogen, by its very virtue of not containing any carbon, coming more into the fore. And so from across the EU, United States, down to Australia, and all places in between, there is a global desire now, I think, to see hydrogen as part of the answer to meet those global challenges. And today, as we meet, companies like Cadent Gas and Northern Gas Networks are working on that high deploy project that Felix mentioned at Keele University to inject 20% hydrogen into the mix, to actually test in real life conditions the ability to try and decarbonise the gas in their grid. Manufacturing companies in the UK, like Worcester Bosch and Baxi, are already having third-party testing on their 100% compatible, hydrogen-compatible boilers. So they are preparing the ground, ready for the UK market, should the decision be made to convert the network or parts of it to hydrogen. And this work is important, we believe, because that approach, we believe, will minimise the disruption to consumers and therefore the cost as well to conversion. Because consumers are going to have to face up to the reality of the costs associated with decarbonising the UK. And the lower we can make that cost, the greater the chances are that we get acceptance from it. And I know from earlier work that Policy Exchange have done, taking the consumer with us on this journey means that it's more likely decarbonisation will actually take place. And I'll put it on the record, I am the first to acknowledge that the current Energy Minister, Claire Perry, absolutely gets this. Her direction, without doubt, is helping industry prepare for change. And when a minister in a round table says to industry participants, it's a no-brainer, why isn't this done? Then, believe you me, it is a very clear incentive for industry. Now, this report highlights the opportunities that a hydrogen economy creates, the regional development impact, particularly in the north, the potential for the UK to actually become a global leader in hydrogen technology. But it also, quite rightly, outlines some of the remaining challenges for both policymakers and industry alike. And Josh, if our grant funding has helped shape the direction of travel to meet the energy trilemma, then EUA is delighted to have played its part. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Don't know if this mic's working particularly well. I'll stand up for that. So I'll start with you, Simon, if I may. So Mike outlined it, I outlined it earlier. This strikes me as a regional opportunity for hydrogen production, industrial decarbonisation, perhaps greater integration of renewables, given they are located in, well, around the UK, but a lot of the system constraints are located around the northeast and Scotland. How do you see hydrogen working in a regional context, perhaps from your constituency?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Josh, for the invitation to join you, because I am hugely excited about the potential for hydrogen to play a really significant role, not just in our national energy mix in terms of security and sustainability of supply, not just in terms of our commitment to decarbonisation, although that's personally very important to me and to a growing number of colleagues in Parliament, but also with my local hat on as a representative of Teesside. And you'll note that today's report, which I think is excellent, has got a foreword from my colleague Ben Houchen, who is the first elected mayor of the Tees Valley. And it was to everyone's huge surprise and in my case delight that the Conservative Party won the mayoralty of the Tees Valley. And Ben has set about launching what is a really important programme of industrial renewal centred around clean energy and its potential to make sure that our area is at the forefront of making this technology happen. There's no question that there's a lot that green energy brings to Teesside, be it with offshore wind, be it with carbon capture and storage potentially, but this is the third arrow in the quiver. And we have, as many of you may know, a unique cluster of energy and chemical expertise on Teesside, dating back to the legacy of ICI. And that is something which has to form the centrepiece of our programme of making sure that we recover from what was a very, very difficult period in our local history, the end of traditional, often very carbon-intensive, heavy industry on Teesside in a period really starting from the late 80s, running through until the closure of the SSI Steelworks in 2015, has been incredibly traumatic and has left the area shorn of the identity that was associated with that hitherto unblemished record of expansion, expertise, and exciting, skilled jobs for life. Where we can make a difference, I think, is in becoming the UK's real hydrogen hub, becoming a hydrogen centre. I had Chris Grayling up to meet Ben and I last December, and one of the things he was enthusing about, for example, is hydrogen trains. We've got Hitachi at Newton Aycliffe, just down the road from my constituency, and if you can start to tie in some of the, I hate the word synergies, and you'll have to forgive me for using it, it's such a dreadful one, but it is true that we have a unique offer to make, I think, in terms of tying together existing industrial strengths with new ones, and if we can make this happen, if we can land this, it would not only be fantastic for my area, but I think we could really make a go of leading the UK effort so that we do take a global lead in this technology as it develops.
Fantastic. And I think we all know how important it is to get Treasury on side with this. How are your powers in the Treasury?
Well, I'm delighting the government at the moment all the time with my stance on Brexit, so I'm sure that my stock is high. I sit on the Treasury Select Committee. I do therefore get access to ministers, and look, there is a cross-government consensus. You referred in your address, Mike, to Claire Perry and the way that she really gets the dynamics of what we're trying to do with energy. And I don't think there is now a dissenting voice in government or really in the Conservative Party as a whole in the way which there would have been 10 years ago to the idea that we need to look at how we deliver the lowest cost switch to clean energy, and that actually there are opportunities in that switch as well as challenges for the consumer. So all policy, I think, has exceeded expectations in this field over the last decade. We've seen this extraordinary collapse in the cost of technologies like offshore wind. What we want to do now is make sure that the same incentives exist for hydrogen, because if we can get that right, then you will carry people with you. If this is presented as a hair-shirt, unpleasant, cost-heavy switch for some fairly remote goal, then it will be a very difficult sell, particularly to lots of people in constituencies like mine. But if you lead on this in such a way that we really do make sure that the costs are falling and people can see that this is actually the right thing to do, but also the right thing for their wallets, then you will win this argument within government and, crucially, with the electorate.
Fantastic. So next, David, I'll ask for your take. I know the CCC have got a publication forthcoming in November maybe, so your insights would be appreciated.
Great, thanks Josh. So I work for the Committee on Climate Change with the statutory advisors to UK Government and Parliament on climate change. 10 years ago, we recommended the 80% target for 2050 that you'll be familiar with. And that was an exciting time. It's an equally exciting time now. 2 days ago, the Minister, Claire Perry, asked us to look again at 2050 ambition, to look at how the goals of reaching net zero can be achieved within the UK. So it's really interesting to consider the role of hydrogen not only in meeting the 80% target, but also how do we get to net zero? What is the contribution of hydrogen within a very, very, very low carbon energy system? And it's been said a couple of times already today, it's not hydrogen or electrification, it's some combination of them. What we need to do really is wherever we supply energy to end users, that has to come without carbon. We have to take carbon out before we give it to them, and whether that's electricity, whether that's hydrogen, whether it's hot water in heat networks, doesn't really matter. And then the question is, well, what's the right balance between electricity, hydrogen, hot water, in terms of meeting those demands in a cost-effective way? Now, the analysis that we've been doing for our report that we'll publish on hydrogen next year, and it's been a real year of hydrogen reports, hasn't it, Josh? And we've also we've been doing a parallel one on biomass, bioenergy, because we're gluttons for punishment, and doing one complicated report wasn't enough, so we did 2 in parallel. But really, that's led us to a conclusion that hydrogen can be really useful. The place where it could probably add the most value within the energy system is displacing natural gas, where otherwise it's really hard to get rid of natural gas in the energy system. So this is not necessarily doing all of buildings' heat with hydrogen. You know, that would require a huge amount of hydrogen. That comes with challenges around how do you supply that hydrogen, and while it's feasible in some ways, there are big challenges. The role for buildings should be much more around the peak heat demand. How do we achieve the necessary energy supply on the coldest days in a cost-effective way? Similarly, in industry, there's emerging evidence to say there's a really important role for hydrogen in decarbonisation, alongside carbon capture and storage being implemented directly there. And it's the transport story, I think, is more uncertain. It's been mentioned maybe as a bit more binary. I think electric vehicles are in the lead at the moment. Claire will talk, I'm sure, more about the transport challenges. There are also opportunities for using hydrogen as a natural gas replacement, for example, in power generation. Peaking power generation on, again, the kinds of plant that only operate a few hundred hours a year. Can we replace the natural gas or the diesel that we're using in those with hydrogen? The National Infrastructure Commission work on heat decarbonisation pathways was mentioned earlier, and really we're drawing a similar conclusion to what I think they drew, which is you can look at a hydrogen pathway, you can look at an electrification pathway, you can look at something more like hybrid heat pumps where you keep the gas grid but you electrify a lot of the heat. And we think the costs come out similarly. The modelling for us actually shows similar costs, but hydrogen being slightly more expensive than some of them, but really it's in the realms of uncertainty. We don't know which is cheapest. And that really then says, well, let's not just think about costs, let's think about the other things, let's think about how we can deliver this and which is the most deliverable solution. What's the public's attitude to this? And it's interesting, we commissioned some research recently that concluded basically normal people don't know anything about hydrogen for heating, they don't know anything about heat pumps. So we've got a big challenge if we want to go straight to those kind of solutions. There are big challenges on supply. If you want to do a huge amount of hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture and storage, that's not zero emission. That's maybe a 70% reduction, at most an 85% reduction on the emissions of natural gas. So you really do want to concentrate it in the areas where it's most valuable and get the zero carbon solutions in there. And finally, I'd like to finish by saying I started working on hydrogen in 2002. Since then, we've managed to have some hydrogen buses running on the streets of the UK and not much else in terms of action. If we actually want to have the hydrogen solution for the long term, we need to actually take some action to create it, rather than it always remaining one for the future, which so far in the 16 years I've worked on it, it always has been a few years off. We need to change that, otherwise we'll get to 2050 and it will still be a few years off, and we won't have taken advantage of the opportunity.
Thank you. So David, what do you think those actions look like? If we want to kick things on over the next couple of years, what would your couple of recommendations be? If you don't want to...
I would say read our report next month, not only because I want to keep the tension up for that, but also because we haven't necessarily finished writing our recommendations nor discussing with our committee. I mean, there's a challenge with hydrogen, which is, we don't have large-scale, low-carbon hydrogen supply, nor do we have the hydrogen demand. And it's pretty difficult, actually, to build those two things up in parallel. And so actions that we can take that either create a hydrogen supply without needing necessarily to go and do lots of things that can only be hydrogen would be useful. So whether we produce hydrogen and inject some into the natural gas grid, whether we produce it and use it for power generation where we already have a market, whether we put in place hydrogen-ready boilers or hydrogen-ready turbines in the power sector, to break that interdependence between demand and supply, so we can just get on and do something without thinking, well, we can't do supply because there's no demand for it, or we can't put in place the demand because there's no supply. We need to break that, and that, I think, will be a key focus or recommendations on taking action in the 2020s. And crucially, if you want large-scale hydrogen, you're going to need carbon capture and storage, and that's a critical area to take.
This is music to my ears. This really is.
Great, thank you very much. So next, we'll hear from Claire, perhaps on the transport side of things and what the Hydrogen Hub are doing more generally.
Yeah, sure. So I'd obviously just like to also start by wishing you all a very happy Green Great Britain week. So I actually work for a policy consultancy called Acuity. So we always approach these kinds of weeks with obviously a great deal of excitement, but also fear and trepidation, because our friends at Bayes seem to have a little bit of a habit of storing up the last sort of 2 months worth of policy announcements and then dumping them all on the same day. So I'd like to thank Josh for inviting me to be here, not only because this is a great panel discussion, but also because it means that my colleagues have had the unenviable task of sifting through policy announcements. Yes, I think this. I read this report with a great deal of interest, and one of the recommendations that I think really popped out to me with the work that we do at the Hydrogen Hub was this recommendation, this call for a greater coordinated leadership from industry and from government. I think the discussions that we've had today and what we've heard already make it very clear that hydrogen has a really key role to play in decarbonisation. And I would say from a Hydrogen Hub perspective, we would say that actually 2050 targets, let alone net zero targets, are actually not possible without it. But it doesn't go so far as to say that just because we have a great solution, a great technology with a lot of promise, that necessarily means that we will see a large-scale hydrogen economy in the UK. I mean, just ask the boys at Betamax. Just because you have the better technology doesn't necessarily mean that you will see it actually deployed in any kind of volume. So I think there are question marks around there about, is the UK going to be a leader in this, or are we going to be playing catch-up in 10, 20 years' time? What sort of scale are we going to see hydrogen deployed in what sort of time scales? These are questions that need to be answered. And I think what I see at the moment, this is where this coordination thing I think comes in, is I see a lot of disparate, unconnected, uncoordinated hydrogen projects. We have the Hydrogen Hub, we have the hydrogen H2 mobility, we have high deploy, we have high for heat. I mean, if we can think of more words to put at the end of high. But actually not a huge amount of coordination between them. And whilst I think that each of these different technology areas, you can make a standalone case for each one of them. Hydrogen transport, hydrogen in domestic heating, hydrogen industry. Actually, the case becomes a lot more compelling when you look at that big picture. I think, when we look at large-scale electrification without any hydrogen, the larger the scale you get, actually, the more challenging it gets. Whereas I think with hydrogen, as you start to fit some of these puzzle pieces together alongside electrification, actually the case becomes much more compelling. I think what we have here is basically two different animals in electrification and hydrogen, with two different sort of strengths and areas. And I think, we often say that we see a sort of electrification as the Usain Bolt. He's sort of fast off the start line, very powerful over 100 meters. Whereas sort of hydrogen is more of the Mo Farah. A little bit slower off the starting block, but he's going to get to 26 miles and he's going to keep going. And actually, when we look at this decarbonisation piece, it's not a 100-metre sprint. It's a marathon. And the last thing we want is for Usain Bolt to get to the end of 100 metres and Mo Farah hasn't even got his boots on yet. So it's important that we build this big marathon, large-scale picture case for hydrogen, but whilst also making sure that we're actually doing something now. We're actually deploying the technology that we can deploy now, working on answering those questions that still need to be answered, but still doing something now. And that's what we've sort of focused on in the Hydrogen Hub. We think that local clustering, local hydrogen hubs is the way to go. And I think, what's going on, or what's hopefully going to happen in the Tees Valley is going to be a really important part of that. But also, again, with the transport side of things, can we use the same sort of set of infrastructure for cars? Can we have one central production facility for cars, buses, forklift trucks, and actually start to make some of those economics stack up, where they wouldn't at the moment on a national scale, but would on a local scale. And I think these next few years are going to be really crucial for the hydrogen industry. The government is going to have to take some decisions in the early 2020s as to what it sees the future of heat and to some extent transport being. So we actually have a fairly small window of opportunity to demonstrate some things around hydrogen and to make the case for the future. And that's my sort of call to the hydrogen industry is we need to have some coordination, we need to have some leadership. We need to keep pushing on this because no one else is going to do that for us. And I think, as I said, I think this paper is a really important part of that picture of making the case for this technology into the future. So thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you. And do you think it should be industry-led or government-led? How would this coordination take place in practice?
I think the two have to go hand in hand. I think realistically, these things always have to really be led by industry, but you can't plow on in industry alone. But those two things have to come together. There are some things which the industry needs from government in order to be able to move, but government can't take those decisions unless the industry puts the case on the table. So I think it starts with industry, but I think it has to be a partnership.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, we'll go to Marcus. One of the things that policy change I think has done particularly well going back over the years has taken the perspective of the consumer, and that was mentioned earlier. So I think we all think green hydrogen's got a huge potential, but the costs at the moment are particularly high, and if we want it to be mass adopted, we need to bring that cost down. So what do you think the opportunities are to lower the cost of hydrogen produced from electrolysis? What would you like to see from government? What are the levers that can be pulled?
I think there's a need for a top-down view of the energy system design that we'd like for 2050. I think within that you're likely to see an electricity grid and a gas grid. The amount of use of each and the expansion of each is open for debate and modelling, but you need gaseous energy as well as electrical energy. So, you can have that top-down view. Within that, the next level down is to say, well, what can you do with hydrogen now, and how might you expand it in the future? So that's very much sector-specific. One thing you can do, for example, in RED 2 will be to locate green hydrogen production at refineries to help decarbonise conventional fuels and chemicals. So this is going to be a policy which will enable across the EU those traditional chemicals and fuels to be decarbonised. That's one large industrial process activity. The other one maybe is the transport one, where the proposition of the customer is superb. You only need to buy about 40% of the energy to drive the vehicle the same distance as you do with a petrol vehicle. It's a fantastic efficiency improvement due to the electric powertrain and the fuel cell and hydrogen tank on board. We've only got a couple of hundred vehicles in the UK right now. We operate 7 refueling stations, mostly around London, each with an electrolyser. In California, they've got about 4,000 vehicles already. Toyota will be producing 30,000 per annum from 2020. So we're riding a curve upwards on the mobility where the proposition for customers is superb. The refill time is very rapid. The range is very long compared with battery vehicles, etc., etc. So when you've got a fit between hydrogen and the end user that looks really good, there's an extra value proposition, hydrogen can work well. So I think we should start imagining how are we going to get to something like 8,000 petrol stations all with hydrogen. So that's what we've got at the moment, about 8,000. I think there are about 15 in the UK with hydrogen right now. So there's a journey to plot. And obviously it will take time because it always took time. If you think back to the Toyota Prius, do you remember the cynicism around that in the late 90s and early 2000s? The last 10 years that's been doing very well as a vehicle, as a hybrid vehicle. So it takes a while. So the transport thing's pretty clear. The power sector thing as well is pretty clear because look at our electricity grid, it's underutilised. The vast majority of the year the transformers are operating at something like 30% load. So we've invested all that money in the electricity grid, which is only stressed during midwinter. The rest of the time it's available for doing something else. All we do with it at present is deliver electrons to people. So we only think of it in terms of directing electricity to end users. If we think of it in terms of making green hydrogen, then there's many, many hours a year when that grid is underutilised, we could make a better utilisation of it. That happens to coincide with when renewables are often plentiful and the marginal cost of electricity production drops and sometimes is in excess. If you look at the price duration curves for 2030 comparing with 2020, you see the availability of pretty green energy, much cheaper than it is today, is going up and up. Therefore, there's a reason to use the electricity grid better. The amount of hydrogen we can make is certainly compatible with the likely hydrogen demand for vehicles in 2040 or 2050. So there's a great compatibility there, a nice synergy, to use that word, between the power sector and its fuller utilisation and the mobility sector. There's some big decisions to make about what we do with offshore wind. That's the good news story now, but when we get to 2030, if there's 30 gigawatts of it, what are we going to do then? There's more out there, but you cannot cram it all into the power system. You're going to need to convert it into molecules and pump the molecules into the energy system. So the electrolysis approach is to convert that green energy into green molecules, if you will, so you can get to an energy system which has a lot of green electrons, a lot of green molecules. I think finally the heat sector is the biggest problem. It definitely is huge. The building stock is rubbish. We live too far north. We consume far too much heat. We need much more radical energy efficiency efforts to reduce our demand. That will simplify and cheapen the cost of transitioning the existing system to a cheaper, lower carbon heat system. One of the things we can do early is power to gas, as has been mentioned. Many companies have been demonstrating this for getting on for 10 years now, and you can go to low concentrations in the existing gas system as a small decarbonising agent, the same way as you do with biomethane. You can also consider decarbonising the methane component. If you use the hydrogen with CO2, you can synthetically produce methane, or SNG, to displace the natural gas. So there are many things you can do with hydrogen in the near term to help the heat problem. Solving it completely is a tough ask and will be a long journey. So I think we need to look at these sectors individually and look at the coherence of the argument for hydrogen and make sure policy supports the technology that exists today, and separate out where you have an R&D need for further R&D before you have that technology available. And don't hesitate, do something with what you can today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I found particularly interesting when looking at the role of electrolyzers as part of this report was the use of them in other countries such as Austria and America as supplementary balancing options. Do you think there's much scope for that in the UK to provide ancillary services? If not, what can be done to help that, or do you think that's just a non-starter?
We think it's a very good option because as you remove the coal power, as you decarbonise with more renewables, your whole electricity grid gets more variable, more fragile. You're only ever a few seconds from a blackout unless you can balance the system well. So if you visualise a large electrolyser load on the power grid, it's extremely useful as a flexible load to balance that system. And there are no CO2 emissions associated with it. Whereas if you continue to use gas turbines or coal power, you're obviously balancing the system, making CO2. So there's some win-wins there. Where would you put the hydrogen? Well, obviously, initially, your mobility demand is small, but your gas grid is huge. So it can convey away quite a lot of hydrogen, quite readily, from what we've already invested in. And it's good to, separate out the nature of the mobility and the industry and the heat problem and make sure the policies are appropriate for each sector.
And do you think electrolyzers could compete with batteries in the ancillary services market at the moment, or do you think we need to lower the cost of electrolysis provision first?
Technically they can. Briefly, the grid services market breaks into two. There's a frequency response market, which batteries are very good at. Electrolyzers can also do that. But it's quite a small market, whereas the big one is the negative reserve market. When it's essentially windy overnight or during low demand periods, we're going to curtail all that in 5 or 10 years' time. It's going to be large. No, we should absorb it and do something useful with it. That's where electrolyzers fit best.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll ask the panel one question. We did 2 events at both Labour and Conservative Party conference on hydrogen, and one of the questions that kept popping up was that the whole hydrogen agenda, the concept of a hydrogen economy is being driven by certain interested parties, the gas networks, the gas producers, and so this is just a way of them looking at how they can retain their assets in a decarbonised world. Do you think that criticism is fair? Do you think the hydrogen economy is kind of a genuine game changer, or do you think the way the narrative has been constructed is sort of, perverse in that respect? David?
I'll have a go. Look, it's not surprising that owners of gas networks would want a solution that means their gas network is still operating in 30 years' time as opposed to having shut down. That doesn't necessarily mean that that proposition is flawed just because they have an interest in it. But I think it's important then to separate the self-interest from the arguments, and if they can make well enough reasoned arguments that are difficult to refute, then absolutely, and the analysis that we've done says, yeah, there is a role for retaining the gas grid, and relatively small amounts of gas flowing through it for the coldest days looks valuable. That doesn't mean you suddenly do what we do with natural gas today in 30 years' time with hydrogen, because that's an awful lot of hydrogen and there are huge challenges around that. But yeah, I think they've got a point, and I think they reacted against a narrative that was electrify everything with let's do hydrogen for maybe not everything but a lot of things, and probably the right balance is somewhere in between us.
I think it's fair to say as well that it's really important that this is not seen in isolation. This isn't a technology which will operate in and of itself. We've heard from Claire about how it ties in very neatly to the work we're doing with wind as well, and I'm a big believer we should try and get a more rational debate on onshore wind as well as offshore, incidentally. The truth is, it can't be an all mentality, it's got to be and. I mean, I took a letter from 130 MPs to Downing Street last month calling for net zero. There is huge cross-party support for this, but I'm under no illusions whatsoever how challenging that will be to deliver. I mean, 80% by 2050 was ambitious. 100% is going to be huge, and that is going to require big investment in new technologies and getting a market-led framework set down by government such that the private sector can make a reality of this, and doing so in good time to do it. And put it this way, I haven't been having conversations with colleagues who I've spoken to on either side of the House who are hostile to this. I really don't detect a pushback. So I'd be very surprised if there was any serious challenge on those lines.
I think there is a little bit of a point there in terms of the way that things are portrayed. And one of the things that we found really helpful within the Hydrogen Hub is working with hydrogen champions from outside of the hydrogen industry. So one of the companies that we work with is Arval, who are a car leasing company, who are in essence completely and utterly technology neutral. They don't care whether it's going to be a battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen future. They just want the best products for their customers. And they see hydrogen as part of that mix. And so bringing alongside people who aren't necessarily within the gas industry or whatever, who can champion the technology is actually a really important part of making that case. So I think you're right. It's the right solution, but it's also having people within the group of people who are advocating for this technology who don't fall into the well, you would say that anyway, wouldn't you category.
Marcus, anything to add?
I think mainly the technology availability is there. I think it's the policy that's not there. So we need to see, green hydrogen in the RTFO. We need to see feed-in tariffs or something similar for injecting hydrogen into the gas grid to enable power to gas. We need to interpret RED II, if we're still part of the EU, I guess, or do something similar to decarbonise large industrial processes with hydrogen. When you see those policies and that framework exist, then industry will move. Right now, we can't really move because we build to order. We're not producing in any volume, so you cannot get economies of scale. It's not a technical barrier, it's a policy weakness, really.
Thank you. Following that, Simon, then, do you think...
Gauntlet's been laid down there, by the way.
On the Treasury Select Committee, and do you think there's appetite there to loosen the strings around it and feed into it?
I mean, the truth is, of course, that everyone has been pleasantly surprised, as I said earlier, about how well the mechanisms which were set out by, and this is, in fairness, this is a cross-party consensus across British politics, which is incredibly helpful. So the Climate Change Act 2008, that is something which is, widely supported. The coalition's electricity market reforms, the wider work we've done to try and make sure that you do get the sort of incremental shift of lower costs as technologies get rolled out. I think there is an appetite to do things which make sense economically and make sense environmentally. The Treasury is a hard nut to crack. We have to be clear that there isn't money sloshing around, and particularly in light of our headline commitments on things like the NHS, it is an even tighter environment ahead of this year's budget than last year's. But this is the kind of investment which, and indeed, Derek Lobiet said, the dread word's borrowing to invest, because as long as you're not borrowing for day-to-day spending, I think most Conservatives are now of a mind that actually we have got the structural deficit much more under control. And, something like this, if we don't get it right, it is going to impose huge costs of its own in 20 or 30 years' time. We just will not have an energy system fit for purpose. So, as businesses on Teesside emphasised to me, if we maintain our current carbon commitments, they will simply be forced to go offshore because they will not legally be able to emit in the way that they do without new solutions. So there are massive, this is a very dynamic equation. We cannot look at this purely in terms of the upfront costs. There is a huge dynamic model to work in here about what you will be costing yourself and the taxpayer, when we hit the 2050s. So I think the Treasury will buy into this if we can produce credible, well worked through studies, and this is why events like this and all of us, I think, going out there and using our sectors to make that case and to really crunch those numbers such that they stack up.
Thank you. So we've got just over 10 minutes or so for questions, and from the audience, if I could ask you to give your name and organisation, that would be great. So can I just get a quick show of hands, and then I'll take them in clusters. Okay, so the gentleman there in the glasses and the gentleman in the white shirt behind to start with.
Hi, so it's Steve Griffiths from Solid Power. I've read your report with interest, and you were talking about hydrogen for domestic heating, and when discussing the possibility of hydrogen appliances, the assumption was made that there would be some work on combustion solely, and I just wondered whether there was a consideration that was made for fuel cell technology, which of course would offer much more cost-effective and efficient options for using hydrogen domestically. And of course with the added benefit that you would be producing or not producing any nasty particulates like NOx and SOx. I just wondered if there was any kind of consideration on that technology.
For my part, it was mostly about looking at what the options are in terms of gas blending, pumping, using the existing gas network for hydrogen. So there wasn't a huge deep dive in terms of the fuel cell side of things on the domestic side. But I think, David, you've done some work on your hybrid heat pumps and things like that. You could.
Yeah, I mean, the modelling that we've done with Imperial College, I mean, it had fuel cells in there and the model didn't choose them, and that all comes down to the cost assumptions. So if the fuel cells can get cheap enough to be able to compete with some of these other options, then absolutely there could be a role. And as you highlight, there are advantages in terms of being able to generate the power alongside the heat, and particularly that will tend to be at peak times when we particularly need the power, and advantages in terms of air quality. So, yeah, there is a potential role, but it's subject to the cost coming down to a point where it can compete with some of these other options.
Thank you. Jasmine in the white shirt.
Chris Friedler from Green Alliance. I just wanted to ask, a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the way that the industry, a small group of people within the industry are focused around hydrogen sounds very similar to a lot of CCS efforts from previously. What could hydrogen do differently to CCS to get a more sort of fast and wider policy support?
Thank you. Who wants to tackle that one first? Simon?
CCS is a cautionary tale, you're quite right, because there have been false starts in the past, and the White Rose and Peterhead and all the efforts have been made to get it off the ground. Of course, what that speaks to in truth is what we all know in this room, which is that when you're attempting large-scale, profound change of this nature, it's a pretty scary business for central government to get behind, because it is essentially something which is asking them to take a significant political as well as economic risk. I believe, incidentally, it's worth prefacing my remarks on this, I think that the government is serious about getting CCS back off the ground, and I think there will be announcements in the relatively near future which will be quite exciting on that score. In terms of what hydrogen needs to do differently, I think actually we start in a much better place, because as we've heard, the technology is there. It's not like CCS, part of the challenge is that if we do it, then actually we've still got to prove that the technology will actually fly, whereas hydrogen production, Teesside is already a significant producer, not on the scale that will be required for the sort of shift that we're talking about, but there is a huge amount produced in Redcar just up the coast from my constituency. So you remove that risk almost, without needing to go any further. In terms of, making the case for why it works, I also think that, this is again easier because you simply will not be able to, however much clean energy reduced from green sources, if you're not able to actually store the stuff, without the molecular element, then you have got a complete policy inconsistency. So on both counts, you start in a better position. But the lesson is, you've really got to nail down the sums. You've really got to bring the costs down. I mean, that's what's frightened people off CCS. Bottom line is, it's just so damn expensive. If we can find a way to make sure that this doesn't come across as such a daunting commitment, then that in itself will take some of the sting out of it, I think.
Thank you. David?
I'll have a go at this one. I mean, I was in charge of the chapter in 2008 where we said demonstrating CCS was really urgent, so we didn't do very well with that recommendation in terms of succeeding in having the influence. But, I mean, the difficulty is, we've said if you try and meet an 80% reduction by 2050 without CCS, the cost will be about twice as much without CCS. Now, you can update your modelling and that might only be 70% more or 50% more now. But of course, our target is not always going to be 80%. We're going to need to go beyond an 80% reduction, whether that's by 2050 or some other time, he hedges. So we thought that would be impactful because, well, if you can halve the cost of meeting your target, why wouldn't you want to do that? And yet when it comes to doing the projects, that's a big check you've got to write. And that really is the big barrier. It's convincing Treasury that, yes, this is expensive, but the alternative, getting rid of fossil fuels almost wherever you can in the energy system, is even more expensive. Well, that's a difficult argument to make. the size of the check you have to write is a difficult challenge anyway. Even if you're convinced it's the right thing, it's still a very big check, and Treasury doesn't like writing very big checks. So how can we learn from that and say, well, how can we do this in a way that scales up over time rather than being very binary? Either we're doing this at large scale or we're not doing it at all, in which case the answer is probably we're not doing it at all, because that's the way it seems to have worked with CCS. So that would be my research.
Marcus?
I think as well you need to get very clear in your mind what the renewable approach is, or the green hydrogen approach, and what the CCS approach is. So, the Dutch, for example, are looking at repurposing North Sea oil and gas rigs to make hydrogen offshore by electrolysis using wind energy, and then piping it ashore with the existing infrastructure. They're looking at making man-made small islands off the coast, or even on Dogger Bank, which will convert of the order of 100 gigawatts of energy at some point in the future. We ought to be thinking big like that, because our North Sea coastline is huge, our resource, our territory is huge, and philosophically, you take a green electron, you use some water, which is in a cycle on the planet, and you convert it into a green molecule. There's no CO2 in sight. There's nothing to leak. There's nothing to go wrong. Whereas if you look at the CCS approach, you have a methane infrastructure supplying, you then have a hydrogen infrastructure delivering, and you have a CO2 waste stream going somewhere. So you've just gone from a single gas methane system, which we have now, to a 3-gas system, each of which needs a degree of compression and conveyance, and you can only make pipes so long before you need to join them. And we should bear in mind, CO2 is a bad thing as a global warming gas, but hydrogen is 6 times worse, and methane is about 6 times worse than that in terms of its GWP. So, you need to take a view on what you're actually doing with your energy system, and how much of the green approach you want, how much of this gas-dependent approach you want, and what may happen in the future.
Thank you. David, you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a lot of talk by various speakers about the role of electrolysis and the value of that, and we absolutely think there is a role where you can help to manage the electricity system and get surplus electricity, very low-cost electricity. It absolutely potentially does make sense to do that, though of course there are going to be other potential demands for that electricity that mean that it's not necessarily going to be free, it might just be cheaper. But when you try and do a really large role for hydrogen in the energy system, given the efficiency loss of producing hydrogen from electricity, given the high value of electricity and still significant costs, even with the cost reductions we've had, you're talking about still pretty expensive hydrogen. In our analysis, I know we've heard other assessments that it might be cost competitive by 2030. And you're talking about a huge amount of electricity capacity, low carbon, zero carbon electricity capacity that you'd have to build to supply enough hydrogen to really do hydrogen at large scale in the UK. So I think absolutely it's got its place, and it can be low cost using the surplus electricity, but I don't think the surplus electricity is actually that big. That's what you found. And beyond that, you're talking about something that still looks quite expensive. Obviously, if you can make the electrolyzers cheaper and more efficient, you'd want to do that, but I think it's about getting the balance between that versus using the electricity more efficiently, even if it's got some other downsides in terms of the characteristics. Do you want to come back on that?
We're going to disagree on that one. I would say I remember well the electricity industry's reaction when we tried to get them to adopt renewables initially, 15 or 20 years ago. They really didn't want to do it. They were used to gas and coal. We got over that hump, and I think 1,000 gigawatts has now been deployed globally, and the next 1,000 will be deployed by 2023. The smart money has gone into renewables, and the costs are dropping, and most countries in the world are deploying it. We ran an interesting feed-in tariff experiment where people even prepared to slap the stuff all over their houses for a few years until we pulled the plug on it. And the point was it worked, and we now have 13 gigawatts of solar in the system, roughly. So, essentially we need to look at the rates of change that can be achieved by manufacturing industry if markets grow. And we're already seeing that happening with wind and with solar power. We can see the same thing happen for electrolysis if we can move, as I said, from built to order level of manufacture through batch production and into volume production. and so can the fuel cell car providers and the fuel cell bus providers and train providers, etc., as soon as the production volumes go up. So I think there's a coherent argument to say probably you're going to see significant cost reduction for the green hydrogen pathway.
Thank you. Time for two more questions. So take the gentleman at the front and the gentleman behind. Thank you.
Philippe Carpentier, independent investor. On the topic of electrolysis, the way I understand it is that it's very capital intensive, and therefore you'd like to run it flat out. So how is that not a big stumbling block right now, given the main incentive behind it is capturing surplus electricity from renewables, which are intermittent, etc. And is there not a role perhaps for linking, say, nuclear power with the production of hydrogen, given both are very capital intensive and like to run flat out? So that's my first question. The second question, very quickly, is I actually come from the natural gas industry, and I still struggle to see how the hydrogen industry is going to convince the natural gas industry to introduce more hydrogen in its network. Now, obviously, for the network operator, they're pretty, fuel neutral or relatively fuel neutral, so that shouldn't be such a stumbling block. But for a gas supplier, apart from a policy-driven obligation of introducing, say, 5% of hydrogen in the networks, would there be some kind of incentive that could be introduced to convince them?
Thank you. Do you want to start with that, Marcus?
I think the first one is partly about volume of production, manufacturing rate. I think, however, most analyses show it's an OPEX problem, not a CAPEX problem. So it's all about the cost of electricity as the input for the electrolysis and the grid services payments the electrolyzer can earn from the grid operator. If you look at national grid data and you look at projections for 2030, you'll see that the availability of electricity down at around the £40 a megawatt hour or cheaper level goes up to about 6,000 hours a year, whereas at present it's about 1,000 hours a year. And that is because we're going to have a lot of renewable energy available at times when demand is low. So using that input energy is relatively cheap. It doesn't necessarily have to be in surplus, in which case there's a separate question about what is the value of the surplus. It's actually quite cheap electricity. And you reach a point where the renewable providers want a load to dump their renewable energy into. So the power system needs to create new load, and therefore it can provide hydrogen that way. The second issue is about the natural gas industry. Well, obviously their product, their source is natural gas. They wish to continue to sell it or use it in large volume. Injecting biomethane doesn't help that. Injecting green hydrogen doesn't help that objective. Converting the natural gas to hydrogen via SMR, that helps the objective, because the process is only, 70% efficient, so you actually consume more gas to make the same output hydrogen. How will it be influenced? I think the same way that the car industry was influenced. Targets were set, grams of CO2 per kilometre, they didn't like it, then the targets got tougher, and they adjusted, and I think that's where the gas industry is heading personally, because at the moment it's responsible for an awful lot of global warming because of the scale of the use of natural gas, and for a long time it's got away with being seen as the better version relative to coal, but we're getting rid of coal, so now it's the problem. So I think it'll be regulation, essentially.
I think panel to briefly add, or move on to the last one. No. Okay, take the last question, gentleman at the back. Thank you. No, just next to you there.
Thanks very much. I'd like to return to the topic of net zero, if I may. Simon, I believe your letter called for a net zero target by or before 2050, which sort of aligns with the latest findings of the IPCC report, and I believe that Labour have rolled in sort of in agreement with your target there. It doesn't leave a lot of time. One of the interesting things I think in the letter from government to the CCC, creating another complex report for David to get his teeth stuck into, one of the interesting passages in there was around innovation. I guess with a recognition that no one really predicted what would happen with solar, with battery, storage, with onshore wind, and so on and so forth. We don't have huge amounts of time, and a lot of the technology is already in place, is what I'm hearing from the panel. But where do we think the innovation needs to come in regard to hydrogen, particularly thinking of those final percentage points of getting to net zero? Are we looking at hydrogen blast furnaces that we're starting to see, courtesy of Vattenfall? We hear about hydrogen trains and so on and so forth. Where do we require that extra little bit of innovation?
Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right that this is a big, bold commitment, and the brutally honest answer is we don't yet know how we're going to close that final bit of the gap. And I think actually anyone who did say would be taking a guess rather than anything more than that. But actually, what we've seen, I mean, if you look at the statistic, which I repeat until I'm blue in the face because it is such a good one, that the UK has managed to decarbonise the most whilst growing our economy the most of any G7 country since the Rio summit. It's proof positive of what happens when you set a framework, if you like. And we have set an enabling framework, and I'm a big believer that government shouldn't be trying to tell the scientists and the industries how they get to the point. We just set the destination and then should provide constructive support so as to best make it possible. I do think, and this is taking it somewhat into a different topic, that nuclear fusion may have a role to play on this. I mean, I'm constantly struck. I keep getting all of these boffins coming to my constituency office because Teesside is awash with all of these different centres of industrial excellence, and there is a huge appetite, I think, to make sure that nuclear has a role to play in this. The costs of Hinkley Point are crippling, and I am not a big fan, frankly, of where we've got to on that. I think 92 quid per megawatt hour, until, frankly, the end of my lifetime, is not a very clever place to be. But nuclear fusion is the holy grail, and there's a lot of excitement about making sure that we really continue to get our teeth into this. Hartlepool has the potential, again, banging the local drum, but there's a nuclear power station there. There's a lot of enthusiasm from people like Chris MacDonald at the Materials Processing Institute to try and make sure that that becomes a real focus of excellence and innovation, to try and bring that technology into play. I don't know whether that will work, but it's an example of the kind of something which we just don't have yet, which could in itself be a game changer, on top of what I hope will, I mean, were we to get the ongoing rollout of renewables, the rollout of CCS and the rollout of hydrogen, you are getting a long way there, and there will, and if you think about the pace of change in the last 30 years, another 30 years is an awfully long time for new stuff to come up.
You work within an industry group?
Yeah, sure. I would also point you towards the Global Hydrogen Council reports. They've got some great graphs in there about where different technologies are up to in terms of towards commercialization, which gives a good indication of where the additional innovation is required or where sort of additional investment is needed to get those products up to sort of commercialization point. So yeah, I think that's probably not a bad place to start when looking at where we need to see more innovation.
So David and Marcus.
On innovation, it's important to reflect, how long it takes to bring something through all the way from the drawing board to deployment at sufficient scale to make a difference. And work in 2015 by the UK Energy Research Centre said that's normally around 3 decades. So on the one hand, you could react to that and say, well, that means there's not much room for innovation in meeting our targets. But what I would say is, it means you're not starting from the drawing board technologies. You're starting from the technologies we know about today that are maybe not commercially viable today because we haven't got the right support structure or they haven't come down the cost curve, but they're known technologies. And what it says to me is actually, go ahead and deploy those, provide the framework that allows people to innovate and bring the cost down. Don't just wait for the magic widget to turn up in a couple of decades' time and solve all our problems for us, because that isn't going to happen. So really we need to get on and use the technologies we know about today.
Finally, last words, Marcus.
I think implicitly net zero means radical change, radical innovation. I think most of that innovation needs to be at policy level to get things moving, as David's alluded to. I think we need to think very seriously about whether we want to use our geological stores for storing green hydrogen or filling them up with CO2. I think it would be far better to be used as a buffer for the future energy system, because you will need large amounts of zero carbon energy to access when there's no wind or no sun, as occurs on some days a year. Therefore, we have a huge storage problem to face, and using what resource we've got, and offshore wind obviously is probably the biggest local one we've got. Possibly importing the stuff from North Africa as well, and we've seen things from Australia as well. But radical is the key word, and the only report I know of is about 5 years old, is a report called Zero Carbon Britain for 2050, which has got some ideas and a Sankey diagram in terms of how you achieve that. I think also, just briefly, because we mentioned fuel cell CHP, that does actually give a proposition to the end user. It reduces the amount of energy we use relative to the use of boilers for making heat, because you also make power. So you need a radical policy to encourage fuel cell CHP and discourage hydrogen boilers, for example.
I mean, actually, something I missed in my answer as well is, of course, it's not just how much we produce, it's also how much we use. And one of my big things as well is, we're talking about a massive increase in house building in this country in the near term. Our building standards are woefully poor when it comes to energy efficiency. Something like that is really important. The other thing I should have raised is interconnectors as well, because that is something where I think we need to look at, what we can do. I look at our links to, say, the Nordics and how much energy they could potentially produce and how much we might be able to tap into that. And indeed, for us to sell surplus energy if we were in a position to do so elsewhere.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to call time there. So can I get a big round of applause for our panelists and all our speakers today? Thank you very much.